Okay, welcome back. I am going to just briefly introduce our panelists, but the one piece of paper with Ali Rahnama's biography I've misplaced. So he just wrote 4 words for his biography, the humble being that he is. I will accordingly shorten everybody else's to match the 4 words. So here we go. We have Sushian Zanganipur, our moderator. He is a tech entrepreneur and social justice advocate. Go Sushian. Formerly, Sushian was a policy analyst and Iran program manager at the Simon Center for Nuclear Non-Proliferation Research, analyzing development in Iran's domestic politics and its nuclear energy program. We'll go to Ali Rahnama, civil rights attorney, constitutional and jurisprudence scholar and enthusiast. Ghazal Hares is a member of the Afghan Independent Commission for overseeing the implementation of the Constitution. She's the only female member of the commission and leads the institution's effort to examine and interpret provisions of the Constitution. Seema Sabit is a senior reporter and presenter on international TV. She joined the network in 2018 and has worked as a journalist and news analyst for more than 12 years on BBC Persian radio and television. Paya, thank you. Payam Akhavan is an Iranian-born lawyer. He is a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. He's a senior fellow at Massey College at the University of Toronto and is a visiting adjunct at the school's Faculty of Law. He was previously legal advisor to the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal. And he served as legal counsel in cases before the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the European Court of Human Rights, and the Supreme Courts of Canada and the United States. Welcome.
Okay, check. Can everyone hear me? All right? Great. It's very rare that I get to share the stage with an international movie star. So, I also want to thank Air Canada for getting you here on time, as timely as possible. Let's jump into it. I want to try to go through a number of questions that touch on international law and the evolution of human consciousness to where we are, all the way to the transition that's going on in Iran. The point of putting this film screening together was to connect these two issues together. Seeing the kinds of experiences Payam has lived through in his career, how they might apply to this moment we're in at the moment with Iran. So I will start with you, Payam, and ask a very simple question around human nature. Is pain and suffering a prerequisite for our evolution?
Before I answer that, I want to thank my brother Sushian and Nikta and all the others who have done the hard work of organizing this event, and to express appreciation for the very distinguished panelists which have joined us as well. As to the question of is pain and suffering necessary for human growth, very simple question. I would say yes, but if we are really wise, we can choose other means of growing and achieving greater awareness. But I do think that in the context of what I see in the Iranian social and cultural space, that there are indications that there is now emerging a shared humanity which allows more and more people to transcend the traditional political, religious, ethnic, and other divides. And I think suffering can take us into very different directions, which I suppose is my own story. Suffering will invariably bring about grief, it will bring about anger, it can result in one's degeneration, one can go into a dark abyss, and that can have very catastrophic effects, especially at the level of society. societal norms, but one can also use it as an occasion for profound transformation to achieve a more profound level of humanity. And I think that this is what we're witnessing in the Iranian democratic movement. When, for example, we see a mother mourning the loss of her child, we don't need to ask what was the particular ideology or identity of that particular victim. We begin to understand that human rights is about the inherent dignity that every human possesses. So, but my concern is how much more suffering do we need before we wake up, and is it possible through our own reflection and collective will to achieve that shared humanity without prolonging this suffering? And that's the question which I think is before all of us now.
Yeah, I think we'll come to specifics of transitional justice later in the panel, but one very basic question is, these folks that have had some of the worst things happen to them in history, how have we mitigated the primal instinct for revenge? What are the kinds of best practices you've seen implemented well in these post-conflict environments that have provided adequate level of relief or resolution for the victims, as well as adequate justice for the crimes committed?
Well, during the break, I met with some friends here who are therapists that would be in a better position to answer that question, but I've invariably become a therapist, even though I'm a lawyer, because I've dealt with so many survivors of genocide and trauma. And one of the, I think, primordial needs we have is recognition and validation of suffering. I think victims, at the very least, need the opportunity to tell their stories and to at least benefit from the collective empathy of society that is not indifferent to their suffering. And that's always, I think, the beginning of that journey towards humanization, transformation, and eventually achieving some form of justice. So very often, for example, truth commissions, whether it's in the context of South Africa or the Indigenous residential schools in Canada, they are victim-centered justice as opposed to focusing on punishing a perpetrator. And in Iran, of course, I had the experience of helping establish the Iran People's Tribunal for the victims of the 1988 mass executions. And it was an incredible occasion to see what this meant for the families who had to suffer in silence for so long, to be given a platform simply to tell their stories. But I think that there is also room for justice, which is different than revenge, in the sense that justice is about retrieving the past in order to build a better future. And I think the worst thing that societies can do is to sweep these crimes under the carpet in the name of political expedience, because that will guarantee that these profound wounds will manifest themselves very typically in very violent ways. What is it George Santayana famously said? That those who forget their past are condemned to repeat it.
Yeah.
So that's why we need to have a much deeper understanding of what a democratic transition is, what the role of justice is, what the role of healing is, what the role of reconciliation is. And it's very difficult to have that reflection when we are filled with so much grief and anger, but it's especially because of that that we need to have this deeper conversation.
I'm going to jump over to Ghazal about living through a country that was transitioning for a moment. There was a beacon of hope, lots of institution building. Give us a bit of a sense of the context of how you found yourself in Afghanistan doing the work that you were doing.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the very warm welcome. I am very honored to be a part of this very distinguished panel. I come from Afghanistan. I recently relocated to Canada. I was in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over. I was there. I was still working, it took us quite a bit of a journey to finally make it to Canada. But that's not just how our lives in Afghanistan were shaped. When I was very young, when I was 12, the civil war broke in Afghanistan and we had to become refugees. So this is the second time I'm becoming a refugee. To become a refugee and go to Pakistan. I lived there for 10 years and grew up pretty much with a sense of, with a conflicting sense of identity, like who I am, being uprooted from my own country, from my culture and network, and then going to another one, which was quite different. And then you constantly hear what's happening back home and how people are suffering a lot more than you're suffering because there's poverty, there's continuous conflict, people are being killed or being raped. That basically impacts your, even your social development. So when I went back to Afghanistan in 2002, I was hoping I would be able to contribute to what was, to the institution building in Afghanistan. But of course, I mean, I was very, very ambitious because back then I was just a high school graduate, but I was still hoping I would contribute to the extent possible. The institution building back then was a major, major challenge because of the decades of war. The institutions were destroyed. When I say the institutions, the infrastructure, the human capital, the resources, everything was destroyed by the war. And then rebuilding that was a very difficult, time-consuming process. A lot of challenges were there, but the major challenge were basically the three that I just counted. And the human capital was one of the major problems back then. How do you bring in all these people who have left the country and for them to come back to be part of this institution building and the development of the country? That was one of the major challenges. But what our journey has, my own journey has taught me, when I went back to Afghanistan in 2002, I was a high school graduate. When I left Afghanistan in 2022, I was the ombudsman for Afghanistan, the state ombudsman, and I was dealing with the cases of corruption against high governmental officials. So
your job was to investigate people in the government that were alleged to be corrupt.
Correct.
In simple words, yes?
Yes.
Okay, great.
And that, in short, explains that when people are given the opportunity, they will go back, they will try to build their country, contribute in the development of the country, and be part of the institution building. It's not an impossible task. It can happen, but of course it needs a lot of dedication, a lot of human capital, resources, which Afghanistan did not have. But also you need to have an overall legal framework, which I think Afghanistan, we were lucky to have, to get that in the very early stages of development in 2004 when we got a constitution. And in the constitution, a lot of issues were brought in, including a very comprehensive chapter on fundamental rights that ensured that women were part of all the political processes. There was additional focus on women, particularly because of what they had gone through during the Taliban period. And I think that also allowed the contribution within that transitional period not to just be from men, but also men and women together. I'm not sure if I answered your question properly, but to just summarize, there were a lot of challenges, but at the same time, a lot of opportunities. And I think within the 2 decades of transition that we're talking about, Afghanistan had significantly changed right before it fell back into the Taliban.
Yeah, no, the reason I'm asking is I'm almost foreshadowing what I hope will happen in a more positive way in Iran, and asking for your guidance or foresight of what could be done now to prepare the grounds for a more smooth transition or better institution building back home. So one of the challenges I picked up from my research on yourself and your work was the work had a lot to do with culture, a culture of corruption that had sort of allowed to be festered there. And it's not putting Afghanistan on the spot. I think it's a trait that transcends borders across the entire region. So given your experiences there, what might you do differently if you'd gone back and had the same task at hand?
I think when it comes to Afghanistan in particular, there's less of doing but a lot of redoing, because in 2002 and 3 we were going through the same period of transition, and the Taliban government had collapsed and we were supposed to do the rebuilding. And now we would have to do the same thing if we had the chance. What is going to be different, of course, particularly with regards to corruption, is that back then corruption was minimum, and over the years, of course, with the flow of aid money that came to Afghanistan, and it's important to discuss the fact that when the aid money comes to a transitioning state, a state that's post-conflict and is moving towards development, there are billions of dollars just flowing, like flood of money coming to a country. And those are the times when the international community takes charge of bringing the aid, but they do not take charge of ensuring accountability and transparency. And I don't think Afghanistan is the only example of such a tragedy. I think this happens in a lot of developing countries, and most of the time it happens right after there has been a major flow of international aid. So I believe that from the beginning it should have been limited. There should have been demand, or similar like anything else the international community was expecting to see in Afghanistan, that there should have been demand for accountability, for transparency as well. Secondly, what I think when it comes to corruption, I think majority of us across the world, a lot of the countries that deal with corruption, I think we do know what the solutions are. I mean, we talk about legal frameworks, we talk about strong institutions, we talk about institutions with teeth, and enforcement of those legislation. But I think we know that part. I think that is pretty clear. What is the problem with corruption is, first of all, how are we going to enforce those rules that we have for corruption? And secondly, how are we going to save the process of fight against corruption from being politicized? I have seen in a lot of countries, including in Afghanistan, when the process becomes so politicized that then you keep questioning whether you're really fighting the corruption. That is exactly what happened to me when I finally stepped down in May of 2021, when I realized I really didn't have a job. I really wasn't fighting corruption anymore, because the process had become too politicized, and the government was a lot more concerned with the fact that I was bringing out the cases of corruption of high governmental officials, rather than being happy that those cases or those individuals were being exposed. They thought that the fact that we were bringing out those cases would really impact the credibility of the state and the state institutions. And my question to them was, well, didn't you create this institution for this particular reason? So it's just the politicization of the process. Political will is important. If you don't have that, or if the process becomes extremely politicized, then you're not going to be able to fight corruption. So if I was to go back to Afghanistan, I would set the rules and conditions for fight against corruption, for accountability and transparency from the very early on. You're not going to leave it at a stage when corruption has become endemic and then you're going to start the fight against corruption. You need to start from early on. You need to make sure it's independent. You need to make sure there's a strong legal framework.
Great, thank you very much. Turning over to Simajin. Thanks for joining us in Vancouver and bearing the weather and
Can I just
delays.
add something to
Please, yes.
as Ajahn said? And I remember I was in Kabul in 2002 when Americans just had come to the country. At the time I was a aid worker. There was massive hope in the country. People were happy that they could go to the streets without being killed. People were happy that they could see the army, American army on the street, and they could go from one part of Kabul to another part. It was so heartbreaking when I heard what happened to Afghanistan. It was so heartbreaking when I heard Kabul was done at the hand of the Taliban. I was about a year and a half aid worker in Afghanistan, working in Kandahar, like Nemruz, other parts of very underdeveloped parts of Afghanistan more than anywhere else. And I have a very, I don't know, soft sympathy for people of Afghanistan because I lived with them. I helped, I was an aid worker. Seeing that amount of corruption, how it could affect the fate of a nation, how it could shatter hopes, developments, anything that they built during the last 20 years with this level of corruption that she's talking about, it has a very good lesson for each of us because we are trying to build a better society. We are not going to build a better society as long as we are not going to learn from our history and others' history. So this is really important. If we are here to talk about Iran, if we are here to talk about what is transitional justice, what is justice for society, we cannot talk about it unless we see around. We see the countries around us. We see the other examples. We just saw a very moving documentary from how Payam lived, the experience of justice, the experience of victims who they suffered what was happening in their society. When you hear a mother is saying that my 4-month baby was thrown into the fire, but my main question is, I'm not here to answer to any question. I'm here mainly because I have a talk show and I mainly ask questions. So if you allow me, I will pose questions towards all of you. Perhaps we will have a better understanding of our circumstances at the moment. What are we missing in this movement of mass revolution that is 8 months old? And there are still a lot of questions. We have more questions than answers. We have more problems than solutions. But we are not unique. We are not the only ones that we are at this phase. But at least we can have a collective understanding, collective understanding of a collective suffrage. Because we all suffered. I can see faces here that they suffered the brutality of Islamic Republic. Who hasn't suffered? Perhaps that's a better question. My apologies. Sorry.
No apologies at all. I wanted to dive into some of your experiences as a journalist covering Iran for the past 12 plus years. From your perspective, what are the patterns of threats you see that are the most underappreciated to the Islamic Republic from the outside or inside? What are things that we should be more aware of and maybe organize ourselves more around?
I can't say underappreciated, but I think we have a lot to learn. Okay, let's put it in this way. Perhaps many of you have watched the programs. Families of the victims, of those who were killed or suffered at the hand of Islamic Republic is one of my main missions in choosing my programs. And I've tried to give voice as much as I could to people who they had their life changed by the brutality of Islamic Republic. From the Ukrainian plane to the 67th victims, to the revolutions, recent revolutions victims, all of them. But what is most important is what we can achieve from this suffrage, how we can make a sense of unity from this experience, how we can get a different result if we are scared of 78th revolution, if we are scared of what is going to happen to us afterwards, how we can think about it, how we can see it different, so we are not going to pave the same way. So I think, there are collective questions for our collective understanding of what phase we are at the moment in. How we can understand each other's suffrage. That's the most important thing. I think the main way to unity is I understand what a Kurd or Baluchi or anyone else within that society, within the borders of Iran, is feeling and is living. Then I can say that, yes, I'm talking about them. At least we try.
I think it's not unique to Iran, but many other countries, they don't treat suffering equally. Various minorities are overlooked. They don't receive the same spotlight, and they're less humanized, their suffering. You're from Zaidan yourself, and your PhD was on
my
religious
PhD
minorities.
was about Sunnis of Iran, and my case studies were Baluchis of Iran,
Yeah.
yes.
What would you like other mainstream Iranians to know about these ethnic minorities that they may not know or may not be as aware of?
I chose this particular topic because I knew that Sunnis of Iran are one of the biggest groups that they have been discriminated against. They never had many of the rights, but I have to say, I come from a Persian background. My parents were Shia, so I have to tell you that, I try to understand them, but I doubt if I totally understand it as a Baluch would understand it. But this is a very important case. Each of us have the responsibility, at least a moral responsibility, to understand what is happening to the others in that country. We think that we understand. But if you go to, if you're deprived of wealth, if you're not able to get a job within the government, if you're not allowed to go and get a job within the army, if the only way of making money is just to go and be a kulbar or a sukhbar, selling petrol or bringing goods from the other side of the border or taking to the other side of the border is your only way of living, then you're totally different than many others that they already live in a country. Remember, we are coming from a society that our families, maybe not our families, not my brother or my mother, but many in that country, they are, the average usage of the meat during the last year in Iran has been 3 kilograms. And imagine this is not mainly from Tehran or from big cities. These are people who they are living around the country. So when we want to talk about the unity, when we want to talk about the rights, when we want to talk about how we can unify each other, we have to listen to each other. We have to understand the level that they suffered. If someone has lost a family member during the war, after the war, during the 67 executions, in each of those disasters and horrors that we lived, they would have a better understanding of how a death can change the fate of a family, how it can destroy the whole family. I talked to one of you, she had lost 2 brothers executed by the government. She said that everything in our family changed. Everything changes. Poverty changes your life, your fate, your abilities, your education, your future. And we have generations of Baluchis that they have been illiterated because they don't have national identification. How much it affects our life. If her or his life is not important to me, this is a disaster. This is a beginning for having inequality and discrimination continued in the society that we are trying to build.
Oof, heavy stuff. I want to come to specifics about the transition, and I'm going to segue to Ali Rahnama first, and then loop back around to folks. Ali, please explain what is the National Assembly of Iranian Jurists, and maybe share a little bit about your background in the 2 North African countries that you've you were doing some constitutional research on.
Sure. First, I have to say thank you for this panel and bringing together this important documentary. I think watching this documentary, I was thinking about a lot of things that I have personally experienced as a kid growing up in Iran and how that shaped me. The story of Mona is very relevant to Paya, but the surrounding story, the background, the context of that is very relevant to me. I think one day we were talking about a few days ago in a live, on Instagram live, and you asked me why this type of work. I think the first time I asked questions from myself, I doubted the system I was growing up in, was when I was in 5th grade. And we were, at the time, there was established a new system for educating what they called the special talents. They call it Tizushan. And in the 5th grade, I was going through this whole process to get into one of those schools. And we were 5 people in our school who we were very probable that we would get in, right? And we went through the process. 3 of us got in, 2 didn't. Now, those 2 people were actually way better than I was, or any of the other who got in. But one of them was a Baha'i person, and one of them was a Jewish person. Now, I'm from Shiraz. It's very normal in Shiraz to have that type of mixed people based on the background in a school, especially in elementary school. I never accepted for myself the fact as to why, or never came to terms with it as to why I got in, they didn't. And that was the first time I started doubting the system around me. The second time, which hit me harder, was that my dad started telling me stories around what happened right after the revolution. When the revolution happened, the first months after the revolution, in a neighborhood in Shiraz called Saadiye. Saadiye is a place in Shiraz which the Saadist shrine is. And he was telling me, I don't know why they didn't tell me before that time, but maybe it's because I started acting out as a teenager as to what happened to my friends that they didn't get in, and he started telling me this story. The story was that at a time, a big number of people in our city start attacking Baha'is in Saadi. And when that happens, one of the families who knew my parents brought some of the folks who could run away, got lucky, run away from the issue. They came to our parents, they stayed with us, and then later on my parents helped them getting out of the country. Now, I didn't know about this until I was, a teenager, right? And what the horrors that he was explaining to me were not that just someone showed up at someone's door knocking, saying, hey, you're a Baha'i, you're a bad guy, or beating him up. The horrors were that they literally burned people down, burned houses with people in it, and took their stuff. And this happened in 1979 and early 1980, right? It's not something abstract from history. It's something that I didn't know. And a majority of my peers growing up in Iran, they had zero idea about this. No one knew about this. And the only reason I knew about it was because my dad decided to tell me. He didn't tell me early on either. At some point, he opened up. Truth-telling, as to what you were saying, was the reason that I started doubting myself, doubting the society around me, doubting everything that I grew up in. And that doubt helped me rebuild a background for myself, which part of that was if you're in a society and living in a society, fighting for justice, fighting for civil rights, and fighting for making that society a better place must be part of your psyche. But I want to add something relevant to Iran to it. Now, part of my job, early 2000s, I worked for a few very famous professors who do international law, especially what we call comparative constitutional law. And they got involved in the process in the Northern African country right after the, what we called Arab Spring.
Tunisia,
Morocco, right? And Tunisia, and a little bit of Libya. I got back to the back end. And I was lucky to work for them, get involved in this process that involved negotiations between the different groups at the moment, how to come up with solutions, facilitate, mediate between these groups, figure out what it is that they could agree on and build a country on, and then solidify that by coding it as a, whatever you want to name it, constitution or the rest. But because of that experience, I've always thought about Iran. Now, thinking about Iran is part of my identity. As I was talking to Ghazal before this panel, she said, when I went back to Kabul after 10 years of being outside, again I found home. And I've lived in many different places. And I want to go back home. And I think many of people here want to go back home, want to go back, build up that country. But part of that is to figure out this puzzle that is transition. And part of that is transitional governance, but part of that is transitional justice. And you have to relate these two and bring a huge amount of variance together to make sure that you end up with a democracy that truth matters in it, and a long-term democracy stands. Why? Because in Afghanistan, they started as a democracy, but look what happened after 20 years. We don't want to see that in Iran. Now, thinking about these things, one thing recently happened to me, which again took me back to the story of the Baha'is in Shiraz, was I was talking to a very famous Kurdish director. And I didn't know this famous, I've known his films, but I didn't know him personally. I met him a few months ago. We sat down, we started talking. And the issue of, for example, and I know it's a hot topic, the issue of federalism came up. Now, everyone has their own opinion about federalism as a political matter, as a legal matter. These are all good. We started discussing this, and after a while as to why this is good, why this is not good, why he's for something, why I'm against it, whatever, he started telling me his story, which I never knew. He said, do you know why I'm fighting for what I'm fighting for right now? It's because when I was a kid, I remember, and this is early 80s, that I was on this hill, and a few of the villages were gathering at the bottom of this hill for a wedding. And I was coming down to join them, and apparently, I didn't know, apparently it's a very famous day, and Kurds know about this, the Iranian Kurds. An airplane fighter really raises everyone in front of his eyes. And hundreds of people die in a second. Now, I thought I know history. I thought I read. I thought I know about my people. I don't. And if I don't listen to their pain, if I want to come up with solutions, what kind of solutions can I come up with? If I don't listen to what this person has experienced at the hands of his fellow citizens, countrymen, then what kind of solutions can we come up for a future Iran? So I just wanted to add all of these together to say that I definitely believe truth is the way to go. Now, everything else we could discuss, it's a huge puzzle that we have to put together. But truth is where reconciliation happens. Truth is where we could get united to change this regime And truth is where we could create a democratic system after this regime.
I'm going to go off script, off of these questions, because the flow of questions is leading me to a bigger insight. I think that tomorrow morning we may have a very successful movement that topples this regime, or the economy gets so bad that, you know, things go awry back home. But we as a people, and I think, Ghazal, maybe you will resonate with this, we have such an intolerance towards one another's opinions. We have very little democratic capacity in our dialogues, in our approaches to problem solving. And I wonder if this is the main thing to solve before we put the rest of the big structural puzzle pieces together. We need to build a culture of dialogue and tolerance between ourselves. Sima, what's your reflections on this?
Well, the main thing that I think we should build is channels of communication, channels of dialogue. How much do we know how to speak to each other? How much do we know how to build up channels for communication between different fractions of political opinions? No society is unified unless they find channels of unifying themselves. And talking is the main thing that we can do. Do we talk enough? Do we have channels of constructive talk? How we are going to build up ways to put our differences behind, to solve our differences, to find a way forward. This is beyond just being political. This is beyond just supporting one idea. This is about a country. This is about a profound change that we all die to do. So I think, the main thing is just we ask ourselves so many questions, and we have to allow everyone to come up with an answer. So I think everything that we have, our solution, our way forward, possibly, in my opinion, is a kind of collective activity, something which is not only limited to a person, a mind, a fraction, a party. It has to have a meaning for everyone who is living in Iran, every single citizen of Iran.
We've now had, thankfully, some progress on the more structural things as well. We've had the more formalization of the Alliance for Democracy and Freedom in Iran, which is the spokespeople, and they've come out with a draft agreement. As you say, lots of criticism around this agreement. What are your reflections personally about the pace of change, what has been achieved and what remains to be achieved? Ali, then maybe Payam, and then Sima.
I think I was just talking a lot. I would let Payam to go first, maybe.
Sure, no problem.
Well, I want to just echo some of what has been said. The most profound revolution is in building a new identity. And the only sustainable revolution is one which has roots in popular consciousness. So the illusion that people very often have is, let's overthrow this regime and everything will be fine. And one can give 100 examples, Afghanistan included, where we realize that جابجایی قدرت انقلاب نیسته. You know, that just shifting power from one group of tyrants and thieves to another is not meaningful progress. So there is also a question of agency here, people assuming responsibility rather than assuming some messianic figure is going to come and save them. And I think that this consciousness is now at an unprecedented level among Iranians. Civil society, for example, has a profoundly important role to play. I think we should all be extremely skeptical of political figures, whether they're in exile or in power, because politics is about power, power is about corruption, unless it is checked by people. People have to make those who are political leaders answerable. or invariably you become sort of hostage to the whims of those in power, and one can only engage in wishful thinking that we will end up with a benevolent despot. Well, 9 times out of 10, that's not what happens. So I think that one other point which I want to emphasize when our colleagues were speaking about hateful identities, the construction of identity through demonization of others, whether it's Baha'is, Baluches, Kurds, whatever the case may be. Jean-Paul Sartre famously said in his book on anti-Semitism, he said that the Jew exists in the mind of the anti-Semite. If he did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him, which is a very profound thing to say, that whether it's the Baha'i, the Baluch, the Kurd, the infidel, the Mufsid fil Arz, and all of these other imaginary enemies, they are not a reflection of the reality of the victim, but of the reality of the perpetrator. It is the need of the perpetrator to build an identity based on exclusion, based on hatred. And this is profoundly harmful, not just for the victims, but for the perpetrators as well. Something which we don't speak about enough is how violence is the denial of the humanity of both the victim and the perpetrator, which is why we need to understand justice as reclaiming a shared humanity. That's the difference between justice and vengeance. Because ultimately it's this cultural consciousness which is going to allow for sustainable democratic institutions. And we need to start from scratch. I think about the Iranian judiciary, and my friend Ali will know this very well. What kind of a judicial system do we have in Iran? What kind of a transitional justice can we have when we don't have a single independent or impartial court? We need to build these institutions from scratch. And the institutions have to have popular support. And most people in Iran have no idea what a fair trial looks like. I remember when we held the Iran tribunal in The Hague, which was a people's tribunal, people were mystified that there's a panel of judges, there's a prosecution, that you have to have evidence, that you have to have witnesses, and that the judges don't take instructions from someone, they're actually independent and impartial. And we broadcast this by satellite for millions of people in Iran to watch, and many people said, is this what a trial looks like? So the task of building culture is, I think, the most profound revolution that we need to work on. And I just want to end with just one point. I think it's very important that some political figures are coming together, but some of them are political figures, some of them are civil society actors, but the coming together of people is far more important, because political figures come and go, but the roots which we have in our culture, that is what really stays with us. So building a human rights culture is what I think we really need to focus on. We need to focus on civil society. We need to focus actually less on the celebrities, if I may say.
Yeah, I agree 100% with you on that. I think, let me reframe my question, I guess, for all of you, and then I will start to open up questions to the floor, so please get ready for that. How might we hold this revolution and the leaders of this revolution more accountable for the end outcomes that we all want, which is a tolerant, peaceful, democratic system that replaces this existing one? What are your suggestions? What do people who have been waiting for a leader or waiting for something do tomorrow that doesn't require any of those folks, that requires them and their agency and their sense of will today? Easy question. Easy
To ask me?
Whoever, yeah, I mean, to
Okay,
each of you, yes.
My job is to ask questions. I can select. So I can say that who is the leaders, if there is any leader. That's my main question, who we are talking about, and then we can refer to the rest of your question. I'm sorry. So you guys answer.
Two things in my mind would really help us at this point. One is to understand institutions, meaning that you cannot be figures without institutions to create change. If you want a real change that would lead you to democracy, secularism, and peace, and security, you need to have an institution. Now, an institution has many, many different elements that you need to put in it. One is a decision-making mechanism. And you asked in your last question, what is it that we call this ADFI now, I guess, they could do is, first they need to move towards creating an institution, because it's an institution that could bring together a decision-making mechanism that over time could be inclusive, meaning adding other people on. There is a mechanism to think about who could qualify as a political leader, who could qualify as a technocrat, who could qualify as a basically expert. Then next to it, you need an administrative team within those institutions or that institution to push forward the agenda. Now, the agenda has two basic sides to it. One is a planning side. We need to plan. If we want to make sure that when the Islamic Republic is gone, we are going to have the least amount of problems, which means it's still a huge amount of problems, but least amount of problems. And moving ourselves toward democracy, we need to start planning now. And that planning includes how we're going to shape a transitional government, how we're going to shape our judiciary during this transitional period. And I think we could get into it, how difficult that is, meaning that you need to create a new system out of a corrupt system right now with serious legal issues. And also, how do you retain or educate your people in there, meaning the human resources in Afghanistan that we were just talking about? It's going to exist in Iran on a different level, meaning that who are going to be your judges, who are going to be your attorneys, who are going to be the people familiar with the new international standards, but also planning on the transitional justice side to make sure that people understand that transitional justice at some point is about reconciliation, at some points of it it's about the truth, at some point is, there are many different elements in that. So that's one side. And the other side is that you need economic planning, meaning that after every revolution or change, if you cannot bring about economic stability, people are very susceptible to authoritarianism. You want to avoid that. And to do that, you need to have plans beforehand when you get in there to be able to catch up. And lastly, you need to be able to build trust in the current, future government institutions. And to do that, we have to start now.
Yeah.
If we tell the ADFI, go build your institution and start creating a decision-making mechanism, what we're basically telling them is to tolerate each other. What we're basically telling them is you have to be able to work out as a team. You have to be able to understand what you're saying is not going to be the same as what the other person is saying, so let's find a solution. And that's why the answer to that question in a long way is you need institutions, current institutions.
Hazan.
Yes, I just wanted to add from Afghanistan's experience, because we actually went through this experience. And what Payam was saying was actually the story of Afghanistan, where why should you give agency to people? Why should you get rid of those, celebrities and those politicians who, as we say in Farsi, imtihan shode hastan, right? So we have tested them, we have seen how they work. I think a few things are very, very important. First of all, when you're going through the transition, what are your principles, right? What principles do you put in place in order, and those principles could just, it's your vision, it's what you set, and then you try to achieve those. And I think it's important that those are made early on in the process, because it's going to be less politicized. Secondly, what I think is important is that, so you make the principles, you make your framework, And then it's about bringing everybody together. Who do you bring together, right? It's not just a matter of bringing these leaders together. We experienced that, and we know what it brought, what misery it brought to Afghanistan. So it's important to bring in people into the discussion, the people who have suffered, the victims. What we did in our process, like constitution making process, we brought everybody together, everybody who was part of the conflict. The Bonn conference, everybody came together, part of the conference. The civil society was brought together in side events. They were not part of the official conference, the official space where the decisions were being made. The decisions were made by all those people who were involved in the conflict in a way or another. So it's important who you bring around the table. Are they the same people who would make the decision? And then, speaking of transitional justice, what we did in Afghanistan, there was a lot of demand for transitional justice because we had gone through decades of war, systemic human rights violations of different types any type you could imagine. But then the question was, like, how do we go about the process? There were examples brought from Rwanda, there were examples brought from Yugoslavia, Bosnia was a very good example. But then, of course, the involvement of international community played a huge role in Afghanistan, and eventually peace was given preference over transitional justice. Did we get peace? No. Did we get transitional justice? No. So what happened was that these same warlords, these same people who were part of the conflict, they became the decision makers. Then they used the constitutional channels to come to the parliament, become parliament members. And I was just saying that to Ali, when they came to the parliament, the first thing they did, the first ever member bill that was passed by the Afghan parliament was an immunity bill. Why? Because those people were part of the parliament. We were happy because eventually those people were now like part of a constitutional channel. We could not get rid of them, but at least they were not fighting with guns. They were they were in a hall sitting together, talking and discussing. But then little did we know that they were going to end up bringing an immunity law, passing it, and then getting it approved by the president. And when that happened, of course, all the doors to transitional justice was closed. So that's important to keep in mind. How do you bring in people, and how do you ensure that these tested leaders are not playing a major decision-making role? Last point that I would want to mention is, in any given transition, you cannot avoid the role of the international community, the role of the UN, right? That's a given. They're going to be involved. Now that I look at it, initially it looked like a blessing to us. Like you said, Seema, that the fact that people would see American soldiers in the streets in Afghanistan made them smile, made them laugh, because they thought they're here to give us the freedom that we did not have. But then over time, it is not over time, but early on in the process, it's extremely important to take ownership of the process. It's extremely important to keep in mind how you're allowing international community, how you're allowing, whether we're talking about the UN or the US or NATO, whoever we're talking about here, it's important to know what role they can play and what role they should play. You're not going to just allow them to come in and become the decision maker for you. And then, like Afghanistan, at the end, when they leave, they will tell you, we came here because of threats to our national security, but we are not responsible for nation building. That's exactly what Joe Biden said eventually about Afghanistan. So you don't want to end up in a situation like that. You need to, as much as you need to limit your national leaders, you need to limit the international community as well.
Thank you. Very practical. Roger. Any final words before I open it up?
No, I think, we as Iranians, with the experience that we see here and there, tomorrow is 7th of April, anniversary of Rwanda genocide, we have to keep an open eye and keep our foot on the ground. We are at the beginning of a revolution. Very small initial steps of a revolution, and we have a very long way to go. So we have a lot to learn, but I would love to hear from the audience.
Yeah, so we have roaming mics. We're going to take 2 questions at once, one after another. And please, you have 60 seconds, and someone back there will shut off your mic if you speak longer. Please ask a question. Don't run into a long story, because we want to ask as many questions as we can. There's 200 people here. Okay, thank you for listening to that. Down here, then I saw a hand, gentleman with the cap behind you. Then we'll go in that direction. I see you. Yes, there.
Hello, thank you very much for the great panel. We should have more discussion like this so we can be more informed about what is happening. My question is simple. How do you see our rule, Iranian, out of Iran, which there are, I hear, 8 million people. How you see our role? Do you think we are playing effective role? Do you think by going every week and do whatever they do in Iran, which come to the street, is that enough? How we can build a relationship with our country, which we live in that country? How informed are those people about what we demand or what we want? Are they informed enough? My opinion is not really. And I compare with effectiveness of Iranian before revolution. I was here 7 years before revolution, and I could see how those people, which was fraction of what they are here, how much they played role to inform their country, the country they were living.
Great question.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take one more. The gentleman with the hat. Yeah, I don't need the No, because other people need to hear you too. Yeah, thank you.
Anyways, I wanted to thank very much the organizer of this panel to invite you, and thank you for coming. The documentary really touched me, the same way that Mona's decision or Mona's murder touched you, Akhavan, Payam. And we all have been touched. You're not the only one. Many of us have lost our dearest family members or friends, and we are all in it together. My hope and my way of dealing with my people is to see them beyond the politics, beyond their beliefs, and see the humanity, and I invite everyone to do so. This is after 44 years of everything we have experienced, we have a chance. We should not let it go. We should pull together, get rid of it. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for the comments.
Let's do it. Let's finish it.
Yeah, one more question. Yes, we had one in the middle there, then there, and I'll come back here, okay? It's on 60 seconds. Let's do it.
Thank you. Really an honor to be in front of a distinguished panel here. The topic is transitional justice, and during the past few months, we've seen a lot of Iranians here have been really outraged about, people who they conceive as agents of the Islamic Republic living abroad. And they have started campaigns, usually, going and trying to say, this person is connected to the Islamic Republic, that organization is. And I think it's part of the discussion we have as transitional justice. And I'd like to know, ask the question from the lawyers in this panel, what are your thoughts? Where do you draw the line when it comes to finding out who's related or who is an agent of, say, Islamic Republic, perpetrator of a lot of crimes, and where do you line the line between them and giving people kind of like free range to go and without any evidence or anything
like defamation
like that.
And stuff like
this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
they start to go after people because they think somebody has hijab or somebody has beard or somebody has a fancy car, they must be connected to the government. What is the role or agency of people abroad when it comes to that?
Thanks, Hassan. Okay, let's jump into these 2 questions. One was the role of the diaspora, 8 million people living outside. How can we be more effective? Whoever wants to take that. And then second, I think maybe Ali, you can take the second question. Who would like to answer the first one? I am.
Well, maybe I'll just, I mean, these are very good questions. Yeah, they're very good questions which require quite a bit of reflection. First of all, if we understand revolution as an organic process, rather than simply overthrowing one regime and having another regime coming to power, then we realize that the Iranian diaspora is very much part of the conversation. The media in the diaspora is an essential part of the conversation. So if instead of having the fantasy that, we get rid of, the Islamic Republic is a state of mind, not just a set of institutions. It's a series of cultural values which, whether we like it or not, have roots in our culture. Authoritarianism, violence, corruption, prejudice, all of these things, we need to root them out in our own consciousness. So in that sense, it's very empowering to realize that we can all be part of that conversation. Institution building, which Ali referred to, is absolutely essential. We're very good at slogans and chants, not so good at building institutions. And institutions are what outlive this or that leader. Leaders come and go. It's institutions that stay. That's what we need in Iran. And part of institution building is not necessarily building governmental institutions, but civil society. Because when grassroots organizations organize themselves, then they can hold their leaders accountable. So when we talk about human rights organizations, labor unions, teachers' unions, I mean, these to me are the essential pillars of a democratic future, which is why I said we should worry less about the celebrities and more about building these institutions. And I want to just say one other thing. I want to really emphasize what my dear colleague from University of Toronto, Ghazal, has said about institutions that are representative. We need institutions that really represent the people of Iran. First and foremost, the victims, those who suffer. The revolution is being played out on the streets. Kafe Khiyabun, Engelab Kafe Khiyabune. And yes, in the diaspora, we have an important role in echoing their voices, but we have to be careful that we don't hijack their voices. So we need to ensure that whatever leadership emerges includes people who are Kurds, who are Baluch, who come from different ideologies or what have you. But one thing that I want to end on is social justice, something which is a real problem in our Iranian culture, where we love wealth, we love status, and I think the biggest challenge that we have, which goes to corruption of representative institutions, is to empower the millions of people who suffer. Mardomi ke noon nadoran bokhoran. We really have to understand that as we hold our meetings and rallies in the comfort of our bubble of privilege in the diaspora, that if we cannot create a future in which people can have their basic human needs met, then we're going to have a little bit of a democratic spring before another catastrophe, before another version of the Islamic Republic. So I'm just going to stop there. Thanks.
Anybody else can jump in if they like.
Yeah, I'm just from an Afghan point of view. I think diaspora plays a very important role. When I was in Afghanistan, I always saw that when diaspora were active mainly through social media and media, sometimes there was a lot of, there was some resistance or reactions from the domestic level, from inside Afghanistan, telling them they don't really understand what's going on in the country. So why they're just sitting there in safe countries, in safe havens, and then being like, or taking ownership of the process, or being part of the process. I think that that's not true. I think even if you are a diaspora, you're a diaspora for a reason. You have suffered, and that has that is one reason why you've left the country, you've been uprooted, and you've become the diaspora. So that's something important to keep in mind. Secondly, I think it's important because I was saying international community could be a blessing and a curse. I think the diaspora can really help in ensuring that the blessing part is there and to keep the world attention. I think the revolution in Iran has really brought a lot of attention from around the globe on women's empowerment and women's freedom. And I think that a lot of the time people within the country do not have the access or do not really, they cannot reach the international community, the international organizations. And I think it's the diaspora that plays that role. So I think it's really, really important to keep that in mind and to keep this whole agenda and this whole discourse alive wherever you're located around the world. It's as important as keeping that discussion alive within the country.
Thank you, Raza. Ali, about vigilantism, do you want to address that? How do we prevent this sort of dynamic that's emerged in our community?
That's a very tough question, in a sense that you asked it in a legal sense first, meaning that as lawyers, how are we looking at this? It depends on the legal laws of whatever jurisdiction you live in. So if you want to look at it legally, not socially, you have to go through the process of the legal establishment you live under, meaning that if you think there's a defamation going on, or by you, I don't mean you as a person, the person accused or the organization accused, they have to go through the legal system, and that's how it works. Socially, though, I honestly have thought about this a lot, and it's not unique to Iran. It's not unique to us. It's not unique to this time. When you see a revolution coming, you see a huge divide anywhere, and that huge divide creates partisanship, and partisanship creates easy accusatory language. Now, I think we should start from ourselves. That's the first step. But we have to understand when this is happening, we're not unique in it. And we have to understand that if we had strong understanding of civil society and institution building, even outside in our diaspora, as the question was, then there were ways to address this as a social matter. But if I'm just sitting here talking to you guys and you're talking to me, the whole population of diaspora and people inside of Iran wouldn't receive the message. So that's why I go back to this question of what should we do? Institutions. Whether we think that we are political leaders, good, create institutions. If we still think that we can help with civil society, create the institutions that people trust, and such accusation comes towards someone else, you could set out the message, hey, this is not right. That's how we could communicate with each other, create trust. And one of the worst thing that the Islamic Republic has done to us is that they have killed every link that could exist inside of Iran. And there were times that we had a little bit of a civil society. They really went after it. There were times that you could see people inside of Iran starting to become political leaders. They went after them. And even outside, they keep messaging that you shouldn't trust each other. If someone starts talking out, a huge number of bots online are going to go after that person. And it's easy for us to follow them too. And that's part of what this institution, which is the Islamic Republic, which is the culture behind it, which is the history behind it, is doing to us. So what I think the solution is still going back to institutions, because only institutions could stand against cultures.
Okay. Do we have a mic on this side, or is it just one? Do you have a mic? That gentleman with his hand up there. No, first, that person there. Then that gentleman. Then in the front here. Thank you.
Thank you. In the continuation of what Payam said, my question is towards Simajum. In February, the Charter of Minimum Demand was released by 20 labor union and civil organizations in Iran. We know that we have to make this civil organization strong. That's the only way we can lead to a democracy that we are looking for. So my question is, this Charter of Minimum Demands, which include the right of LGBTQ, the right of those 50% that they live under poverty, the rights of ethnic group that they are oppressed, does not get any coverage that it should be. Why? As a reporter with Iran International, not even one interview was done to introduce this.
I got your question.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Thanks, question. We'll come to it in a sec. Next question as well. Thank you. Yes.
The panel and the organizers, and we need more creative discussions for transition and for the planning beyond. By the way, as I have been contemplating about the civil society and democracy, particularly in the case of Iran, something has been puzzling me. And that's what I think, that an independent and secure justice system and judiciary is a building block and a guarantee for a civil society. So my question is, chicken and eggs, which one comes first? Yeah, and the question is, how can we build that kind of judiciary that is also a guarantee for freedom, that the people are chanting on the street, freedom, so an independent justice system can be a source of freedom. How do we go about that? Thank you.
Great question. There's two more I want to try to take here, and then we're going to do hopefully one more round of questions afterwards. Right here, and then this lady here, and then we'll go back. Got you. Back there, were there any questions back there? There was, okay. Oh yeah, 1, 2, okay.
My question is about something that I came across in one of your talks. You talked about the suffering of people, and that some people arrive just in time to harvest the fruit of those sufferings. Do you think there is something that we should worry about in our revolution? And if so, what can we do as people, and what is the role of media here?
Thank you. Great question. Last question here. Yes.
Thank you very much for the panelists and the people who organized tonight for this discussion. My question is, right now in Iran, as you know, as you said, all of you, the Iranian government created the terrible system that so many are suffering. Poverty, corruption, gender apartheid, and name it. And they created a class, I can say, that they are benefiting from this system. They are making so much money from our doctors who are, getting, taking the people's, health as a profit making to go on, making buildings, this and that, and even our schools, universities, everything. So my question is, you said culture, but I feel, it's a little bit deeper than culture. The people who are making tons of money, how we can, there is a possibility they create war or whatever to not let that peaceful transitional happen, because that means they have to make less money. That means they're going to be less privileged. That means, there is not going to be violence, execution, etc., because this is the tool that our regime is using to suppress people and let those people make their money.
Great.
So my question is like, how are we going to do that? Like, what do we need? Is it international aid can help us, or is it us? And we see the privileged people, they have louder voice because most of the media are working in their benefit. As our friend said, workers or women's, they had a charter of rights, but we don't hear about.
Great.
We don't hear about that because they are from lower class, but the upper class always have voice, always have media, always have people who can speak out louder than the majority of people.
Great question. Thank you. Okay. So first question to you, Ms. Salit, about the charter. Second one is about chicken and egg institution building. How do we get the judiciary set up? What comes first? And then we'll go to the other ones.
I'm not here at the position of a reporter. I'm not here to represent Iran International. I came simply as presenter of talk show, which I have been doing it for the last 5 years. So I don't know about that particular chart. News are not covered just because only media is interested in it. People who they are making that news also have to make it interesting for the media. I was giving that piece of advice to Vahid Beheshti's wife the other day. He was on his 40th day of hunger strike. And she was asking me how we can get public coverage from UK media. And I was just telling her that, you know what, they're not going to come to cover you only because your husband is on hunger strike. They covered it once. They want a development. They want it to be a weak voice. I heard about your grievance or disappointments that Iran International didn't cover most of your events, that you have been really hardly working for it during the last few months. I'm so sorry on my behalf, but I will definitely make sure that the head of the channel would hear about it, and they would definitely, they have to think about it, because you guys deserve to be heard. Everyone, every single person in our society is deserved to be heard and to be taken seriously. I doubt if covering a chart is about a class or is about a gender. Possibly, I haven't been part of any of them, but I covered a couple of the most important events. In my experience, a few days ago, I think it was on Monday or Tuesday, I wanted to cover this Tahad Jomhuri Khan, which they had an event, and I always have wanted to cover them. Technically, I couldn't find any of them. Just one person was available for an interview. So it's not all about the media not wanting to cover it. Sometimes there are other difficulties, other technical issues involved that you never heard of it. I'm sorry.
No, great. Thanks very much. Who of you wants to talk about the chicken and egg question? Who's a good cook? Huh?
Ali makes a good omelette.
So an independent judiciary, that's a very tough question. A few days ago, I was talking to someone about the judicial system before the revolution. And they were telling me that, why don't we simply go back to that? And one real reason is trust. Even if you have the best of laws, even if you have the best of imagined checks and balances for your judicial system, you need to have trust in your people to go to that judicial system, respect that judicial system, and try to work with it and improve it, right? One of the major issues that we have at the moment is lack of that trust. Since the inception of judiciary in Iran, we have never experienced a true independent judicial system. And because of that, every time you talk about a judge's order, someone's thinking who paid him off, right, or her off. even if it was before the revolution of 1979. So the question of chicken and egg, the moment that that's why we talked about planning. The moment that the Islamic Republic falls, we need to have a strong plan in place. And what does that plan include for the judicial system? Many different things. One of them is how structurally, how it's gonna relate to the transitional government, and how it's going to act as a check and balances for that, and that needs to be designed, legally designed, but more importantly, agreed by the Iranian people, which means that it needs to have legitimacy. Even if you have the best design, with that legitimacy, that doesn't mean much. So that's why you need to involve people who are stakeholders, which is everyone, but more importantly, the leaders, more importantly, the victims, more importantly, everyone who wants to get to have their voice heard in part of it, which unions and others who care about their rights are part of that. The second, so that's why we need planning now. The second thing is we again need planning for human resources. Even if you have the best judicial system design, who is going to be your judges? The current judges are going to be your judges, or you have to train them, or how are you going to teach them to use the international standards? That's why you need to start planning now. Don't forget, one of the biggest issues within any transitional justice is the issue of vetting, or what we call lustration. One of the examples is Iraq. In Iraq, anyone who was part of the Ba'ath government was set aside. Because of that, they had no one to run the courts, no one to run the government. So we need to start planning as to thinking which judges are not going to be able to retain because of what they have done, and which judges we are going to be able to retain with a small amount of training or more training. And that's one of the things that our organization was created to do this, meaning that we believe that this government, the Islamic Republic's regime, is going to go either sooner or later. We have to plan for it. And one part of that planning is to plan for a judicial system. The chicken and egg question, we have to have plans for a strong judicial system now if we want to guarantee a transition to a real democracy.
A fantastic question. Yeah, fantastic. There are two last answers. Yeah, please.
This is a very good question, a very important question on the role of the judiciary. It's important to, first of all, to have your guarantees, particularly in the Constitution, for the Constitution to very explicitly talk about judicial independence. But it is not enough. It is important to change the culture within the judiciary. The culture within the judiciary in our societies, Iran, Afghanistan, is that they always find themselves dependent. Corruption, right, could be one factor. Dependency on the regime, on the executive branch of the government, following orders from the executive branch of the government could be another major factor. And that takes away that level of independence from the judges. So you need to really work to do a lot of behavioral change, or to plan for behavioral change within the judiciary as an institution. You see, the political regimes, they come and go, as Payam very rightly said. Institutions remain, and you can change a regime through a revolution, through an election. You cannot change an institution overnight. It's going to take forever, and you have to be very, very patient with it. It's important to think from now on how you're going to contribute and influence in every institution. So it's not just that we as people are responsible that once the regime changes, our job is done. No, we need to influence different institutions, and judiciary is one very, very important one. Civil society in media play a huge role in how judiciary behaves. One of our major achievements in Afghanistan in the past 2 decades was the freedom of media and the freedom of speech. That was something that really flourished in Afghanistan. And that was something that held a lot of institutions within the government accountable. So you need to use that. You need to use civil society, you need to use the media. Another very important thing is changing the educational system. I know Iran is way better in its educational system, especially at the higher education level, than Afghanistan. But in a way, because we're a civil law system, both of the countries, in a way, when we are trained as lawyers, we are taught to just follow the word of the law, which is very different in common law countries like here in the US or in Canada. So what's important is how are you going to start changing your educational system? Because that eventually is going to impact. What I'm talking about sounds like very ambitious and all of that, but trust me, you're not going to be able to change the judiciary overnight. It is going to be a very, very painful process. It is going to be very, like, at times you will completely lose hope and you would say nothing is going to change. But it is important that the guarantees are there and the institution itself believes that it has independence. Every time I thought about the issue with the judiciary, our judiciary was really, really bad. I can just put it like that. And every time I talked about judicial independence, my grandmother's, she used to tell us stories. And one thing that she always said always resonated to me when I thought about judicial independence. She used to say, a cow does not know his powers. If he did, he would know he could take the whole globe in one of its, horns. گاو به قدرت خود نمیفهمه. اگر میفهمید کره زمین به شاخ خود بلند میکرد. Now that is exactly the case with judiciary. Judiciary does not, because of this period, these decades of dependency, they do not really they do not really own the independence. They do not have the courage to be independent. They fear from independence. And you need to work around that, and that is going to take time. It's not going to happen quickly. You need to be extremely patient with it.
Very helpful. Yeah, last point here on this
maybe I'll
egg
just
question.
share a story. During the years I worked with United Nations, I traveled to many countries. And once I was in Cambodia, and I talked to, Cambodia has a monarchy. So I talked to one of the princes, and he said, my son wanted to study in Paris at the Sorbonne, but I sent him to study in Moscow State University in the Soviet Union. And I was very intrigued. I said, why would you do that? He says, I wanted to make sure he doesn't become a communist. So I sent him to the Soviet Union. And there's something important, an important lesson there. It's the illusion of a utopia, right? So when we talk about laws, institutions, we could probably sit down in this room in half an hour and write a constitution for Iran. Beautiful democratic constitution, which would be studiously ignored unless it has roots in society, which goes back to the two different visions we have of politics. One is politics as a reality TV show, the political spectacle, the slogans, the campaign speeches, whatever the case may be. And then there's politics as a participatory process in which the grassroots claim ownership. And that, to me, is the only answer. Otherwise, you're at the mercy and the whims of whoever happens to come into power, which is a very big risk to take, and 9 times out of 10, it ends up in a disaster. So when it comes to, for example, writing a constitution, well, the problem is not writing it. The problem is having a process which allows everyone to participate and feel that that constitution reflects their will. When it comes to transitional leadership, which by necessity is not elected but self-appointed, we need to be that much more careful to ensure that it is representative, which is why I brought up the issue of social justice. And one of the things also is the slogan is not just freedom, but freedom and justice, because they're not the same thing. And I remember working with the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, many of your colleagues and friends, and the question is, what value is freedom of speech if a girl cannot go to school, if her family cannot feed her? And I will just end by saying one last thing, and that goes to your question about exploiting suffering for political purposes. I've been a human rights lawyer for 30 years. Every single political leader I've met speaks about human rights, especially when they're not in power. And when they're in power, they'll speak about human rights with a much more sort of selective account, just as they're violating it. So I think we need to understand that leadership has to be by example. Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Václav Havel, Nelson Mandela, who I was campaigning for as a student. What is their power? Their power is authenticity. Their power was not that they made really nice inspirational speeches, but that they lived by example. And that is the sort of leadership that we need, which goes back to ensuring that we are empowering the voiceless. We are allowing those who are at the margins to reclaim their humanity. And that's the only way that we can have really a genuine transformation, rather than the illusion which every revolution has had, that you will achieve paradise, utopia, whether it's ideological, religious, it doesn't matter. We could go from one fanatical, hateful, violent ideology to another. So this is where I think we need to force, from the grassroots up, rather than from the top down, a new conception of leadership.
Yeah, Ali, go ahead.
One thing very relevant
Sure.
to this, and that's about the documentary, about the leadership example that you were just talking about. When I was watching the documentary, you were standing there in the case of the Rohingyas, and Aung San Suu Kyi was sitting next to you. And I was thinking, this person was in prison for years, this person fought for democracy, this person became an international figure. And she's sitting on the other side.
A Nobel Prize
A
laureate
Nobel Prize
who
Peace
becomes
Prize
an apologist for genocide. So this is a very good question that you asked. We need to be very skeptical of power, because power eventually leads to abuse.
I want to raise something here. There's someone in this room who's been doing a really phenomenal experiment, PhD student, who kind of speaks to the types of issues that we've been talking about. There are a lot of groups out there right now that are, Alliance for this and National this and that. They're all trying to fit themselves into the puzzle of this transition. This group has taken a very different approach. They've decided to come together as a group of thoughtful, ideologically different individuals. And what they're trying to do is answer the unanswered questions together. So what should happen with territorial integrity of Iran? Let's have a discussion about this, and let's document the process. What are all the different constitutions that exist? Let's all analyze those and find the gaps of these. So what they're trying to do is build understanding, build due process, and document this as a way of transformation. I think that, for me, holding whoever becomes a leader accountable is a very important value to me. Maintaining my own independence, not being partisan in any manner, and looking for these types of examples, real, tangible ones, so I can leave here today and not worry about what happens in Washington or Paris or whatever, that me and a group of friends in Vancouver or wherever I might be can begin demonstrating the kind of cultural values we want in the future. I thought I would share that because she's in this room, and I hope that one day very soon she and her friends will be brave enough to share their project out in the open.
One example for a minute only, please.
Just maybe.
Only for 1 minute.
Yeah, no, thanks. There was a woman who had a question to be answered as well, and I'm getting the boot very soon too. So the last question was about aligning the different classes that have different incentives for whether this revolution remains peaceful and secular and progressive or not. Any advice there? Maybe, Ghazal, from your experience living through one, what would we not do? How do we get the people benefiting from this existing regime to begin to see the other side?
That's a very tough question, and also a very tough experience, or practice, sorry, not experience, it's a process. You want to include everybody, right? You want your process to be inclusive, but there are different interests, there are different needs, there are different demands. How do you bring all of that together? That is going to be a very, very difficult job. But then as much as you make the process participatory, people are going to show some level of understanding. They know they have been part of the process. If they know they're part of the process, eventually going forward, they're going to respect that process because they feel ownership of it. They would understand that not all their demands were there. There are certain things that are very different that we want, but there are certain things that all of us want. I think freedoms, rights, right? Strong institutions that can protect and safeguard those rights. There's a lot of things in common. When they see that, eventually, during the process, you will see that the tension is going to ease out. Unless there are very, very strong issues, such as, for example, somebody wants federalism, somebody wants a unitary state. Those are the kind of issues that will continue to be there. And I think from the experience of Afghanistan, something that we learned was people started to accept the Constitution. That was a very, very important issue in Afghanistan. From the leaders to the people, once the Constitution was approved, there was a lot of respect for the Constitution. And I think that helped with the considerable implementation of the Constitution we saw over the year. But it's not going to be easy. That's why it's important that I think the example of South Africa is always a great example where you can agree around principles and not necessarily just demands from each and every group. As long as you agree around those, the ones that are similar among all of you, I think you're going to end up with the framework that's more acceptable to people.
Great, thank you. Yeah?
Can I add?
Sure,
so
last
the
word.
question of the classes, especially what happened after the revolution, was that a specific economic class was almost wiped out and a new one was created. And that class became part of this, if you may, mafia system, and that's benefiting from it. But these are the people who are right in existence, meaning that they were like 20-year-olds who are 60-year-olds now, or, you know, and they're seeing this amount of wealth and they're not giving it up. Your question goes into reparations, meaning that are they scared that after this revolution this is going to be taken away from them? And does that mean that they're not going to help us with the revolution? The answer to that question, I have to say this. Historically, the issue of transition and transitional justice is not new. The same questions we're asking now, the Greeks asked themselves after the rule of the 400 and the 30. The same questions. There were lands that were taken over, and they had to figure out what to do about these lands. The same question came out after the Napoleon's fall and Louis XVIII came into power, and the issue of the biens nationaux, which was the all these lands were given to a new class of people. The answer to that is I cannot, as an expert, give you an answer. You know who can? Get together all those stakeholders to sit down, have their voices heard, and a solution has to come out of that. The only thing I could do as an expert is help facilitate that. I have no answer for that question.
Lovely. Thank you.
Can I add one more point?
Sure,
to that one?
sure.
As I said, there is no specific answer to it, but there is also an answer to it. The unity. If we listen to each other, there would be a seat for unity, and unity is the answer to each other. I just quote Zygmunt Bauman, which says that we are in one of those either-or situations. We either join hands or we join the funeral procession of our own burial in a mass grave. There is no third choice. So I think, the solution to our society is just to understand each other, to listen to each other, to have a will, to unify. Otherwise, there's no solution.
Thank you. I'm very sorry, we are out of time. I'm being told from my boss back there that we need to wrap up. Couple of, there's no time for, there's lots of people to ask questions, but there is a bit of time afterwards that you may be able to ask privately your questions. Before we conclude, a couple of announcements. I'll use my discretion and the mic to do this. If anyone wants a copy of Payam's book, we are selling copies in the back there, and Payam may sign.
Translation is available at Asu.
Okay, and there's an Iranian translation, Persian translation. A Persian translation is available at asu.org. We may post about this as well and share the link. We're also selling some merchandise that helps finance some of the things happening here, t-shirts, bags, and sweaters. This event would not happen without a few people I need to thank, and credit where it's due. First, I'm very important to thank Nikta and Ali Ardakani for their leadership, all the risk they took, all the sleepless nights, using all their points to book people's hotels and this and that. We had a couple of major funders back out of this event due to some very, very discriminatory positions that they took. But we self-funded this, and we pooled donors and negotiated contracts and this and that to try to make this happen. And they were the figures of that. Second, I think important to recognize Farid Rouhani for his help securing support for this event and helping us connect with Simajun and Iran International. There are an incredible number of volunteers as well that really came here just out of the passion of for the issue and for this topic. Tara Dacek, Vasel Amini Pardis, Amiri, Shima Parsa, Parnian Mukhari, Nima Rezai, Shilan and Shine, I think, sorry. Raha Asadi, Daniel, Hassan Sobhani, Marco Firuz, Saeed Shainfar, Mahdi Bayazi, everyone that did everything so far. If I missed you, I'm sorry. Two final people to thank, and then we go forward. Folks that helped us with outreach for the event: Bahar Islami, Hediye Safiari, Fariaz Lari, Kamran Malikpur, Iranian Knowledge, Farid Najafi, and the We Are Masa team who's here representing Amir Bajakian, Amin, etc. We have very generous donors as well: Nikta and Ali, Bob Mayer, Niku Foundation, Azita Ardakani, Joe and Kath, Sadi, dear friend, Mr. Farad Sufi, Farid Rouhani, Mariam Sherkat, Ladan Ranouf, and Nazi Lutfi. Thank you very much for making this grassroots thing happen. And finally, just the panelists for coming here, spending their time, dealing with airport delays and missed flights and taking time away from family, all that stuff. Thank you very much for coming here. No. That's all. Thank you very much for coming and participating. Thank you.
Sigmund Bowman is wonderful.